Are you ready to unleash your full potential and love your practice and your life? Welcome to the Legal Athlete Podcast, where every week I share the science, sports psychology, and neuroscience-based strategies that elite athletes use to dominate their game so you can dominate yours. I'm Jess Sargis, your host and high-performance coach for lawyers. With over 22 years as a trial attorney and legal exec, I've been where you are. But I'm also an undefeated former MMA fighter and coach for professional combat athletes. And now I'm here to use both those skill sets to help you master high-performance techniques and strategies so you can win more, stress less, and love your practice and your life. Get ready to become a legal athlete. Green light. Let's get it. Welcome, everyone, to the Legal Athlete Podcast. I am so excited to kick off today's episode because it's not just any episode. It is our first one with a guest, and I couldn't have chosen a better person to join us. Meet Patty Montagnino. Patty is a licensed social worker with over 20 years of experience helping trauma survivors heal. She is a master practitioner of accelerated resolution therapy, ART, and a certified RTM protocol clinician, both cutting-edge techniques for working through trauma. In 2019, Patty was invited by Brave Step, a Charlotte-based nonprofit, to provide trauma-focused services to survivors of sexual violence. She was named the 2023 Provider Plus Award honoree for her contributions to the Brave Step community. Patty is also a part of a growing team of clinicians throughout the country supporting the efforts of Fairways for Warriors to heal the invisible wounds of veterans. Her practice is located in Matthews, North Carolina, but her work as a coach allows her to serve clients throughout the world. And this is what I thought was fascinating too. Patty has also developed her own brain-based intervention, the Ibredo method, which blends evidence-based therapies into a simple and reliable framework for clinicians, coaches, and peer supporters. Her work empowers people to find peace with the past, thrive in the present, and look forward to the future with joy. So why does this matter to you as a trial lawyer? Because if you work with clients or witnesses who have been through trauma, or even if they've not been through trauma, been through some serious stress and are experiencing it in litigation, you need to understand how trauma shows up in the courtroom, how it affects communication, and how you can better support the clients who are suffering with trauma or who have experienced trauma or are undergoing stress. So Patty's insights, I'm very excited to share, could transform how you prepare your clients and your witnesses, how you interact with them, and ultimately improve your performance as an advocate. So let's dive in and welcome, Patty.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is wonderful. Thanks.
So Patty, when we're trial lawyers working with clients who have either experienced a trauma, experienced a secondhand trauma from a family member, something like that, or they're just stressed because they're in litigation, how do you explain to a trial lawyer who may not fully understand what trauma is, how it presents and what the impact is on a client who is showing up either in court or as a witness? Can you explain just in simple terms, basically what trauma is and how it can affect a person emotionally, mentally, and physically?
Sure. So I want you to think of trauma just super simply as not so much what happened to you, but what happens within you as a result of what happened to you. So it's an event that overwhelms and upsets you. And it can land at the one end of sort of the spectrum in something that's sort of trauma. Maybe it has a diagnosis of PTSD, or it can be at the other end of the spectrum. That's where it's like just sort of stress. And somewhere in the middle is overwhelm. So I want you to think about all of your clients having experienced stress, potentially overwhelm, maybe trauma. So everyone that you're working with is on that continuum somewhere.
Well, I definitely would agree with that in my experience. Let's frame it now in specifically the legal context. How do you think trauma will commonly manifest during legal proceedings? Are there specific behaviors or responses or body language that trial lawyers should watch out for when they're preparing their clients to testify or in court during testimony?
Yeah, so I would actually even just really back it up a little bit before we even start looking at our client. I would encourage your attorneys to look at themselves. So I would really just sort of look at, what's going on with you in your nervous system before you start trying to notice what's going on with your client in their nervous system. So I've worked with military, a medic, and it was sort of this idea of like the first pulse that you take in the room is your own. So you're going to look at your own nervous system. You're going to make sure that you're regulated and that you're grounded. So I want everybody to just do a little self-check before they turn their attention to their clients and see what's going on with them. So if you need to do something to regulate, go ahead and do that, because I want these attorneys to kind of consider themselves to be like a partner for regulating their clients. So we're going to co-regulate with them. So they're going to be the one that's sort of showing the client that everything's okay because they're presenting like everything's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that makes a ton of sense. Yeah. It's sort of like the putting your own oxygen mask on first, is that if you can't function from a calm and regulated place, then it's difficult to have your clients approaching it in that way. Difficult to have them communicate what they need to communicate, what you need them to communicate, so that the judge and the jury understands. Just kind of following up on that, do you think that there are common misunderstandings about what trauma looks like or should look like when a judge or a jury is looking at someone who's been through, say, an accident, and they might not be reacting the way that the common sense person would say that's how someone who's traumatized should react? What do you think some common misperceptions might be?
So I think we're trying to apply some logic to somebody else's emotions, and that's where there's this real disconnect. So someone who's experienced trauma might tell you that everything's fine because that's actually maybe what they've been telling themselves for a really long time to cope with what happened to them. So they may minimize some of the things that happened to them. Now, some people may be overly sensitive to what went on. So maybe you see this hyper arousal or this hypo arousal. So you may get things on sort of extremes, but it doesn't mean that it was worse the more upset I am, and it must not have been that bad if I'm actually not responding very much to what's going on here. Actually, when you really think about it, you've heard about fight, flight, and freeze. Freeze is the last stage of our nervous system that we have to protect ourselves. So if you see somebody that's kind of checked out, really kind of numb, playing it very cool, that a person potentially is almost, I don't want to say more traumatized, but that's sort of the nervous system's last resort to protect. So if you are getting that response, I think that really does need to be sort of weighed heavily to work with that person to get them to sort of actually regulate a little bit more so that they can start to express what they've actually been through, that they actually have access to the words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so important, and I've definitely seen that in practice too. I was working with a client whose adult daughter, had passed away after taking some medications, and she was the guardian of her daughter's three children. At the time that her daughter had passed away, they were 2 and 7 and 11. And then this was 10 years down the road. So she'd been raising these girls, and they definitely had negative and serious negative consequences from their mother passing away. It wasn't getting better. And when we were working with their grandmother, their caretaker, to testify at her deposition about what was going on with the girls and all of the treatment that they'd been receiving, we'd spent hours, having her tell us exactly what's going on with them. And then the first question during her deposition is, "How are the girls doing?" And her response was, "They're good." They're good. And that's the social response, that's the traumatic response. Now I'm understanding, talking with you about, that's what she's been telling herself to get through all these years and dealing with her own trauma as well and carrying on. So I wonder if that's something, not only that we can help prepare our clients a little bit more understandingly so that they are more conscious of what they might be saying during their testimony. And also I wonder your thoughts on having an expert explain how trauma may present, so that a judge and a jury doesn't discount their entire case when they get an answer that someone's going to wave in front of them saying, oh no, they're good.
Yeah, so I think you might want to prepare a client like that for the grocery store response, right? And I know they may have gone back and forth with you and really shared in depth what it was like, and but I would just maybe give them a heads up and say, you know what, when it comes time to talk about this, you maybe feel like you want to give the grocery store response. And if you do, I'm just going to stick with you on that. And I'm going to go, are you sure that's really what's going on? Or I'm going to ask some other kind of questions to sort of get you to sort of really dive in, because I know this isn't easy to talk about. So you really want to connect with them on the emotional level. I know this isn't easy for you to talk about. I know that this, is what you've been having to kind of tell yourself when people ask, because people can't really sort of sit and hear the nitty gritty of this. It's too much. So you're conditioned for that response. If that comes up, because that's the one you're used to giving, I'm going to help you through that. So almost to sort of acknowledge that they may forget, even though you have prepared them, right? That they may forget, and that
Yep.
you will guide them back. I think it does make a lot of sense for an expert to speak to what trauma is or isn't, or how it may present, or why it may present in the way it's presenting. Because I will always look at, I'm not as concerned about what people are doing. I'm really focusing on the why that they're doing it. So some behaviors that may look very destructive actually serve a function. They're actually protecting that person in some sort of way. So this is a protector function that's coming out, going like, nope, everything's okay here, because this is a woman who needs everything to be okay, right? She's just surviving. She cannot handle one more thing that is not going to work out, that's going to create a challenge. And so she needs to present to the world like she's okay, because at the end of the day, the world is not really set up to support her. So she's used to telling the world that she's pretty much okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think what you had said earlier about touching on your own environment, your setting for your client too, because testifying is very stressful, whether it's in, a conference room or a courtroom. And as much as I know we had tried to prepare her, like, this is not your answer to your neighbor. This is your testimony. Like, testify like you would in church, say what's really going on in the moment. That extra stress, I think, on her already very stressed, traumatized system just had her blank out into, okay, everything is good.
Yeah, I was gonna say that is an important point. I think what we have to remember too, and this is where maybe an expert would come in, is that people's access to information when they're stressed and or up to traumatized is very limited. So you may have quite a bit of recall around some of the emotional information of an event, and not a lot of recall about some of the other, sort of information that surround an event. And I know sometimes that can get tricky when people are testifying, because they can't sort of put that little sliver into the whole context of the pie. And then sometimes they don't have access to the information because it's more, they're trying to protect themselves. And that would be, in this already stressed environment, to talk about this very upsetting information would be overwhelmed. So the best thing I can tell you is nothing to see here.
That's fascinating. I'd love for you to tell a little bit more about the way that trauma can affect how people communicate or even recall events, and some ways that might influence their memory or the way that they answer questions in a deposition or trial.
So Our memories are very fallible. I'm sure you're all familiar with sort of how eyewitness testimony works, and why you sort of want to be
Mhm.
able to back that up with some evidence. I know what I know from a lot of true crime, so this is obviously something you can speak to. But what we know is that our memories are changeable and they're fallible. So what we think we know, we don't necessarily truly know. We have an interpretation of what we experienced, and that is what we know. So our memories do sometimes change over time. We're not really great at holding on to episodic memory. That's our sort of the story. So if there is some information, but there's some information lacking, we might actually fill in with sort of what makes sense, because we want to be able to tell a cohesive beginning, middle, end kind of story. Sometimes someone who's experienced trauma, they may not actually have access to all of that information, and they may fill it in with good intention of being able to communicate, but that actually might not be factual. And they have maybe no mechanism to sort of back that up. So we want to know that sometimes the beginning, middle, and end is not really factual. It's imagined, and it's for the sake of being able to tell a cohesive story. Think about a game of telephone, but it's all happening in here. So you pass along the message to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, but it's really sort of what's happening in your own brain. When I recall this version of events, it's laid out this way, but I'm talking to you about it. So now this exchange gets kind of laid in there. When it's sort of saved, it's got new information in it, not changed on purpose, but just changed because we recalled it. And that's how memory works. It saves with new information in it. And so over time, it can actually move farther away from what actually happened because of all the recall.
Mhm. As trial lawyers, one of the tightropes that we try to walk on is making sure that we are getting the truth and nothing but the truth, because our credibility is everything. The credibility of our witnesses, the credibility of the arguments that we're making. What do you think are some ways that we can help our clients stay stay in contact with their best quality memories without filling in the middle, and do this in a trauma informed way, so that they don't feel like we are attacking them or cross examining them about, did this really happen? Sometimes as a witness or as a survivor, the last thing you want to hear from your own lawyer is, did that really happen? So what are ways that we can help them get back in touch with what they really remember, so we can ensure the most true presentation of events to the court and to the jury, and also make sure that they're taking full account of what really did happen to them and what the trauma is that they've suffered?
I think acknowledging that they may not have access to the full memory, all of the memory in this moment, makes a lot of sense. That I think it's okay to normalize, because I think sometimes we think that memory is recorded as, words in a book are recorded. That if the words are there, we pull that book off the shelf, we read the words, they're going to be there today, they're going to be there tomorrow, they're going to be there in 10 years. That's not how memory works. So if an attorney has just a little sense of the fact that you may not remember all the details, that's okay. That's actually, memory doesn't really work that way anyway. And then what do you remember? And then go, okay, let's work with that. And then more things, you may start to remember more things over time. We can slot that in. So I think you just sort of normalize what this process is for somebody as they start to try to recall. I would also suggest that if somebody needs to sort of get a little extra support by going to counseling, that's a great place for them to sort of be able to process some of maybe the emotion, so that they can get to some of the information. So oftentimes we see people have such an emotional memory that they've actually lost sight of some of the details of an event. Almost think about, sort of like there being like a whole stage, right? But there's only the spotlight on this one particular part of the stage or one particular character in this scene. Sometimes what we need to do is actually get some counseling so that that spotlight gets turned off, and it's like the house lights get turned on, like, oh, now I can see this whole thing in the context. It's not just zeroed in on this one little part. And sometimes that's really helpful. So it's just about being able to access what is there, because it's not so bogged down with all the emotion.
That's really interesting. I think I think that's something critical for trial lawyers to understand, is that in order to access the information, your client has to process the emotion.
Yep.
And there are ways that you can help them do that. There are ways that you can refer them to counselors who can help them do that, but that it's kind of like a box that you need to deal with the wrapping before you can get into that nugget of information inside. Other than making sure that you are helping them to process that emotion. For lawyers who don't have a background in psychology or trauma, what are other ways, or what are some first steps that they can take to adopting a trauma informed approach in their practice?
I would walk in and I would just assume that everybody has experienced trauma. So I would, don't wait for somebody to show you that they've experienced trauma, just assume that they have. And by that I mean, check yourself first, right? Make sure that you're approachable. Make sure that you have created a safe space around you in your environment, in your office, in your dress, in your style, in your speech, as you can. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that there might not be some times where it's like the color of your shirt reminds someone of some time when someone did something and you can't know for everything, but you can sort of try to do what you can to make it as comfortable as possible. Oftentimes, just as a therapist's office, we don't have our clients sit with their back to the door, that they're watching the door, that if they want to, they know how to get out. So even just little things where somebody is set up to feel like they're really comfortable in that environment. I would say another thing someone can do is really just take a couple of minutes to build rapport. And I know you know how to talk to people, you talk to people all day long, but I really would say, like, be intentional about building rapport. So if the person that you're talking to talks with their hands, you talk with your hands. If the person is leaning in, you lean in. So you're going to mirror some of what they're doing. Now they're going to come in again, probably a little bit stressed, a little anxious, and you've done this a bunch of times. So you're not going to mirror them in that emotion, that anxiety. You're actually going to be really regulated so that they're going to regulate to you. Like, in your job in this is to almost be like the thermostat that sets the temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So those are just really
Fascinating.
tiny little things to just sort of build trust and rapport and to make somebody comfortable.
I think that's so key, is having the trust of your client. It's such a critical relationship because you have to be incredibly vulnerable with your clients so that they'll be vulnerable with you. And I'm not saying, overshare about your personal life, but you have to give them the real truth about, this is what the case is about. This is what we need to establish. These are the strong points of our case. These are the weak points of our case, so that they are a partner with you in the litigation, and that they feel empowered throughout it, and can bring their best resources to it. If someone feels like they're not being told anything, they're not being respected as a partner, as a contributor to their welfare, I think that's likely a way for your client to shut down. And you're not gonna get the information that you need. They may withhold things from you, whether intentionally or unintentionally. They just don't feel comfortable sharing with you. That could make a really huge difference. So, other than being the thermostat in the room,
Mhm.
and establishing, a comfort level, what do you think are other ways that trial lawyers can help to build trust with their clients and their witnesses?
I think, to your point, be vulnerable, be relatable. I think be the kind of attorney that you would want to have if you needed an attorney. So I think that's what you want to do, is you want to show up. Who would you feel comfortable referring your best friend to? Be that person for this person. So I think that you want to make yourself accessible. You want to make yourself vulnerable. Again, not oversharing, but we feel comfortable. We know this from data. We know this. We feel comfortable with people who can be vulnerable with us. And so that I think is really important in the building of the trust. Now, don't be so vulnerable that you said, "Oh, I got into an argument with my husband last night and we're on the brink of divorce." Not that kind of vulnerable, but the fact that, you know what, these are really hard things to talk about. I would have a hard time talking about this too. I wouldn't like to talk about that either. When I had to talk about this, it was so hard. I really understand. So I think, it's sort of like have the heart of a social worker, but also, do the job of the attorney. That's sort of the perfect marriage, which I know is asking you to do something that, you just weren't trained to do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I love having a guest like you to kind of help us get some additional training and additional background, so that we can do our best to walk that line. It's a difficult one, not only to be compassionate and vulnerable, but also to still give your client a sense of confidence that you know what you're doing, that you are confident about how you can manage their case, how you can win their case. And so I think knowing how to navigate the emotions in a compassionate and relatable way without overdoing it is a really key point.
So I think you also wanted like recognize that if you just give people a little bit of space, they'll probably get there. And I know we're on the clock and time is money and all this stuff. And, but I also want to say if you just pause, people will probably regulate a little bit and they'll get there. And you just want to go, I know this is really hard for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Pause.
pause, because then I think that they might actually kind of then start to say the thing that was hard for them to say. Let's just take a breath together.
Yeah, that's a great technique. One of the things I like to do on the podcast and also in my coaching is help prepare my clients to roll with the punches.
Mhm.
And part of that is anticipating where setbacks might come. So, what I'm curious about is, say you have a witness who is testifying during trial or during a deposition and they become very emotional, or they just shut down when they're recounting the traumatic events. How would you recommend a lawyer handle this situation in the moment to support the witness and still maintain the flow of testimony, or to get the testimony ultimately that they need?
So I think call it out. I see that this is really hard for you. I think, and then that might actually bring them back to this moment because somebody saw them. I think so much of what we want, like we want to be believed. That's why we're there. We have a story to tell and we want to be believed. So if somebody is just acknowledging and that they see you, that it can be very, very helpful, right? Just that little moment of acknowledgement, of I see you, of witnessing alone can really help somebody, come back. Now, sometimes it takes a little bit more. Sometimes, you may actually have to take a little bit of a break and then maybe have some ways to help a client regulate, whether that's breathing, whether that's like sucking on, sort of like, like an Altoid, because it's got that like powerful taste that'll kind of bring you back to the present because it's very shocking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes, you may say, hey, if it gets a little overwhelming and you need an extra second, the water is right there. Just take a sip.
Mm-hmm. I think you said two things there that really resonated with me, both as a lawyer and also as a practitioner of sports psychology, which is that number one, you said basically be there with them, see them, have that collaborative experience, saying, "Look, you're not alone. It may feel like you are, but I'm here with you. I see you." And that might help. I think that experience of acknowledging and seeing your client and being there with them is really, really helpful. And then the other thing that you said with the Altoids, which is a great practical tip, is being in the present.
Yeah.
That so much of sports psychology and the ability to execute under pressure is bringing yourself into the present, is what's important right now, and not catastrophizing, not thinking about what used to happen, thinking about what will happen, but what can you do right now in this moment? And being present in your body and your breathing, in what you need to execute, I think is such a key technique. And I never thought about that before in terms of people who suffered trauma and who are inside their minds like that. That's really interesting. Do you have any other examples or techniques about how you can help a trauma victim bring themselves back into the present as a way to calm themselves and get back on task?
Yeah, to your point, just like you prepare, right, for the trial, you prepare your client for what it may or may not be like on that day. I think you want to help prepare their nervous system too. So whether, I mentioned this before, whether somebody goes to counseling to prepare, that's one way that they can help regulate themselves. But also, this is a stressful situation. Don't wait until day of to start to try to regulate yourself. This is something like build that in. This people are waiting years sometimes, right, to get before, the judge and the jury. Let's build this into this work that we're doing over this time together. So you maybe want to do some breathing practices. There's so many different ones, whether it's box breathing, whether it's, sort of a deep inhale and a regular exhale, or a regular inhale and a deep exhale. There's tons of things you can do to breathe. You don't need to be the expert on all of them, but it would be great for you as attorneys to have a little cheat sheet for people. There's all these sorts of grounding exercises, sort of this like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's bringing the present. It's like the 5 things that you can see, the 4 things that you can touch, the 3 things that you can hear, the 2 things that you can smell, the 1 thing that you can taste. Really being comfortable being in your body is something you can start to practice, because it's going to be really hard to have any level of mastery on the day of, when it's already stressful on top of something that was traumatic.
That's so important. I think lawyers are constantly pressed for time, but there is no substitute for preparation. And I know that that's going to go for our clients as well as in preparing our own legal aspects of the case, is that you can't gain mastery by practicing something once or twice.
Yes.
That if you don't have mastery over it in times of additional stress, it's going to fly away.
Well, we
And
know
I think
the nervous system is looking to regulate, right? So over the course of time, our nervous system is going to sort of kind of imagine going like up and down a ladder all day long, up and down a ladder all day long. So if you were, driving to work, but you're running a couple minutes late, you might be a little bit stressed. But you can pretty much regulate when you get in the car and you get in the flow of things, But then if you hit an accident along the way, you might actually be a little bit stressed again, because now you actually might be late. If you're driving somewhere you've never been, that might amp it up a little bit. If there's, if this is like a really big, super important sort of thing, you may actually become even more. So it may amp up and amp up and amp up, but typically it will come back down. And so very typical things can become very stressful if you don't have the ability to come back down. And so I think that's what we want to do, is we want to teach our clients to the best, that you can in this capacity, is like, it's okay to see your nervous system get a little bit turned up, because it can come back down. And just get used to the fact that there is this sort of up and down that happens all day long. We might just not notice it as such, but even, because by the time you got to the office and you got into the meeting and you're in the flow of the day, the traffic jam and the running late and the couldn't find the parking spot is probably gone.
I think that's just a really important refrain I'm hearing, is that the being present and checking in with yourself, both your witness, your clients, and you yourself as a lawyer, so that you are conscious of what you're bringing in to that room, to that relationship. There's I think a fear also of bringing in something that might be unintentionally harmful to a trauma survivor. So what do you think are some common mistakes that lawyers might make when they're working with trauma impacted individuals, and how can they avoid basically re-traumatizing their clients in trying to get the information that they need for our cases?
Well, that can be a really tricky thing, right? Because somebody who's exposed to something traumatic will likely be re-traumatized to some extent. So I think, you have to almost sort of get that off the table. I don't know that you cannot, sort of re-traumatize someone. It's not intentional, but I think it is maybe part of the process of getting to the information. So I think it is important, right, for somebody who's so traumatized that this is going to be detrimental to them, that they get that work under their belt before they really engage with this process. Otherwise, you're not going to get from this client what you need to get from this client to have a successful outcome. So if you are in that place that it is so traumatizing, then I would say this is not, you should not be working at this moment, that they should be getting some support. Now, I realize you may not have control over the schedule and all that, but I just really think that's important because I don't think it's going to necessarily go the way everybody wants it to go without a little outside support. I think it's okay for you to say to this client, what can I do to support you? How can I help you? Are there words that you want me to use or not use? So I have a client, where there's a lot of abuse on the part of her mother. We don't call her her mother. We just say her. And I don't need to call her her mother to make my point. We just say her. And we move right along. Now, has it happened that I've said your mom? It has, because that's typical language that you would use when describing someone, because I don't have a name. But we have rapport and there's safety between us. So it's really not very triggering for her. Or if there is this moment of like, oh, she's really not my mom. And I'm like, oh, you're right, she's really not your mom. Then I apologize and we move on, So I really think that you have to just sort of, you're human, they're human. You may say something, they may respond to something. But if you just sort of say, I'm sorry about that, and you follow their lead, on that front, I think you should be okay. I think if you just see them, ask them, what can I do? What do you need me to say? How do you need me to say it? That means a lot. Even if they don't have an answer, just the fact that you're willing to change things up to make them comfortable is really meaningful.
I definitely am hearing the refrain of just be human with your clients, be compassionate, and that you may make mistakes, everyone does, but if you have established that humanity and that trust with them, that those are not mistakes that are going to derail your entire case.
No, people know if you mean them harm. They will know that you do not mean any harm. As long as you're intentional about not causing them harm, by repeating the same thing over and over. If you're just going to show up like a decent human being, I think you're more than halfway there.
I think to your point about trying to be a decent human being, most of the lawyers that I know got into law because they wanted to help people. They wanted to be of service. They wanted to help promote justice. But I think that there's sometimes, particularly depending on the subject matter, that lawyers can themselves experience secondary trauma from working really closely with traumatized clients. What are some ways that you can recommend that lawyers can help themselves be more emotionally resilient while still maintaining that humanity and that connection and empathy that's necessary to work their best and to work as effectively as possible with their clients?
Yeah, I work with a lot of professionals, right, who are in those helping professions, whether they're other therapists, whether they're attorneys, whether they're people in the medical field. So therapy is always a great idea. It doesn't mean you have to go once a week, and it doesn't mean you have to go indefinitely. I just think it's really important for people to have another safe place for them to go, especially when the lot is riding on them and their performance and their ability, right, to sort of show up for other people. You don't have to carry it all on your own shoulders. There are people that can help the helpers, right? So reach out to those people. I think you want to build some good self-care practices for yourself. We are going to experience stress every day, up and down. So what helps sort of close out a stress response cycle for somebody? You are going to have a stressor, but you want to close out that stress response cycle. This is probably a whole other podcast, but there's lots of things that we can do. We can work out. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense coming from your background. So we want to give ourselves some positive things to do to process through our stress. I know a lot of attorneys will drink or go into, and that's not a positive way to, people in general, right? But I know a lot of people will look to sort of numb it out, but I actually think it's helpful to sort of process through. So whether that's some sort of movement because it's exercise or because it's just gentle movement like a walk or yoga, Go engage with your body. In nature, have the safe people that you can confide in. You want to maybe do something sort of like your little passion project, whether it's an instrument or art or dance or anything that's interesting to you. Those are all things that help you maintain your best self, so that you can show up and be that best self for somebody else.
I love that so much, because so much of my practice is, you're speaking to my mission right now, which is that for lawyers, self-care is the ultimate performance enhancer, and it's also the ultimate protector. So things like movement, things like having a community and a connection with people close to you, and having an emotional and mental outlet, creative outlet. I was seeing this one neuropsychologist was talking about how they saw that anxiety can shut down creativity. And so what she's been studying is that the more creativity you exercise may also shut down anxiety. So like you were suggesting, doing something that moves you, writing or drawing or painting or something, even if you're not good at it, that creative process can really help you stay in the moment. Again, here we are with being present, and also give you that foundation that allows you to go through very hard things and maintain your wellness and your self-care throughout it, which is, I think, so key. I love that. I love that insight so much. So I really loved our conversation. I like to, at the end of my podcast, always give the listeners some really actionable steps for how they can apply what they just learned. So if a trial lawyer is listening today and they want to start to take immediate steps toward creating a more trauma-informed practice, what are, say, the top 3 things that they can do to implement right away to have a better, more trauma-informed practice?
I think that this is a matter of checking in with yourself. I really think it starts with the self. So take your own temperature before you start to work with other folks. So if there's something about the way your office is set up, if there's something about, the way you talk to people, then make those adjustments. So I want you to know that this is really about building trust, building rapport, building connection. So anything that moves you towards that, go ahead and start to do those things. Building comfort for people. That's what ask people around you, what can I do that would make things a little bit more comfortable? Then, because sometimes we don't see what we don't see. And so we need to ask other people. And I think it's great to do that and get some feedback. I think if you want more information on the topic, there's several things that you can watch or read or listen to. I love a podcast. So you can listen to Dr. Bruce Perry. He co-wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey. It's called What Happened to You. And it really starts to look at some of, what trauma is, what trauma isn't, and in a really accessible, not super textbooky kind of way. There's plenty of podcasts about trauma. We're talking about it a lot lately. So just get some information, and then that's from the experts. Get the information from yourself, because you have your own feedback to give yourself, but you maybe never asked yourself for it. And then ask for that feedback from others, and then take whatever that information is and then start to integrate that into your practice. So the better care that you take of yourself, the better care you can take of others.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I think that's so true. Thank you so much, Patty. For our listeners, if they want to get in touch with you to learn more about trauma-informed practice or any of the great work that you do, where can they find you?
So I have a website, pattymontagnino.com. I know it's a little tricky to spell, but I'm sure it'll be in the show notes, so they can reach me there.
It will.
I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, so people can come see me in person. I can work with people virtually. So everything you really need to know about me is on pattymontagnino.com.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Patty, for the wonderful work that you do, for sharing it with me and with the listeners. And I just wish you so much continued success in helping people lighten their loads and experience more joy in their lives after trauma.
Thank you.